You are listening to Jess FM Radio and watching Jess TV with producer-host Teri Petz. You can watch us live on Facebook and on jessfm.ca or download our free apps on iPhone and Android. The views and opinions expressed here are those of the host and guest and do not necessarily reflect the views of Jess FM, Jess TV, its affiliates, or its employees. I also would like to remind everyone that certain topics may offend some listeners. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our show, For the Love of Poetry on Jess FM in Lethbridge, Alberta, where you can find out about local poets and hear their poetry. I am your host, Teri Petz, and this is my guest, Blaine Greenwood. A few words about me. When I start talking, most people ask me where my accent is from. I grew up in Hungary with a German background and have been in Canada for 30 years. I still have an accent and I haven't lost it because I was an adult when I learned English. And now let me introduce our guest, Blaine Greenwood. Blaine was born in Viking, Alberta in 1951. He is an educator by profession, with a career spanning from classroom teacher to museum educator and event planner. It is from this foundation that Blaine's poetry has come to reflect his interest in psychology, history, and spirituality. His verse has been described as dark, homespun, sensual, rich with images. Blaine was one of the coordinators of the Most Vocal Poets Society. He was, until very recently, one of the artistic directors of Loto's Land Spoken Word Poetry Venue at Fort Macleod, Alberta's South Country Fair, and a past main stage performer. He is currently the DJ for CKXU's Not Your Mother's Poetry, and as that show's host, participated in 100,000 Poets for Change event between 2013 and 2015. Blaine and I will talk about poetry, and he will read some poems to you. How old were you, Blaine, when you first started to like poetry?
I think probably 5 or 6 years of age. And what was interesting, and I was just thinking about this, the previous family that owned the house that I grew up in left some books behind. And one of the books they left behind contained poems by Robbie Burns.
Oh.
So even at 5 and 6 years of age, I was skimming through these books, and it wasn't necessarily the nursery rhymes that were connecting with me, but, as I said, poetry by Robbie Burns. So a much more sort of adult flavor to the poetry than might be expected at that age.
Do you have an example with you?
The one I would mention to you is Flow Gently, Sweet Afton, and I could do that one, but I'm sure anybody with access to the internet could get a hold of it. In recent days, what's really caught my eye are the spoken word artists that are out there, though, and the variety of things they're bringing to poetry.
That's great. I just had an example of spoken word last night. And do you participate in spoken word poetry?
I'm really more of the connoisseur host of that kind of program. I've been told that I write very well, but it's a case of being able to present in front of an audience. That's where I think the rubber hits the road for a lot of people, myself included. I've got one poem that I brought that is not my work, but illustrates how powerful some of the spoken word poetry that I've come across is. If I could read it, please.
Oh, please, go ahead.
This is by a Toronto poet by the name of Greg Frankson, aka Ritalin. And the topic might seem a little sensitive, but I should mention to people I have a nephew who is a police officer, so I'm reading this understanding that there's always two or three sides to a story. It isn't just one way of looking at it. Greg Frankson is in fact a black Canadian, so this will give you an idea as to how powerful the poetry is, that it would even affect me as a white Canadian. Dear police officer, I am unarmed. Please do not tell me that you have a family you need to go home to, because I do too. Please do not tell me that you're just doing your job, because part of your job is to tell me that I'm being detained, why I'm being asked to exit my vehicle, and why I'm being arrested. If you cannot answer these questions, then it is your job to let me go unharmed. It is part of your job to treat me as if I'm innocent. It is not your job to prove that I am guilty. But it is your job to gather evidence, but only with my consent and a warrant. If you have probable cause, guess what? You still have to tell me. If I am selling CDs or cigarettes on the street, it is not your job to kill me. If I'm at Walmart in an open carry state purchasing an air gun, it is not your job to kill me. If my son is playing in the park with a toy gun, it is not your job to kill him. If my daughter refuses to put out their cigarette, it is not your job to kill her. If you screw it up, it is not your job to falsify police reports. And last but not least, it is your job to apprehend those who break the law, even if that includes other cops.
Wow.
As I said, some of these spoken word artists that are out there, very powerful stuff. What I found really interesting after receiving that poem from Ritalin was a week later, a senior citizen in Toronto was shot by a police officer. And I began to realize that there's a black minority out there, but there's also a group of seniors that are on occasion being targeted, and that I'm in that age group and just as easily could have been the target of a bullet.
I thought you were 45.
Hmm?
I thought you were 45.
No, I'm close to 70 at this point. So another spoken word effort that I did come across was after the Pulse nightclub shooting took place. I have a nephew who is gay and in Toronto, and I imagined him possibly being in Florida and at that nightclub the night that shooting took place. Mm-hmm. And that's part of where this piece of work came from. And this is, as I said, my work basically coming out of Ritalin's poem and the fact that I have connections to the gay community through my nephew. Do you remember the one who gave the fist bump after basketball, who devoured Mama's tomato and cheese dip, an uncle who loved his nephew and niece? Do you remember cameras full of beaming selfies, those faces with shining eyes and smiling faces? Do you remember those dancing shoes, that silly top hat, the Gryffindor tie? Do you remember lives filled with English lessons, getting that high school diploma, that degree in psychology? How do you forget that angelic singing voice, that potential star on Hollywood Walk of Fame? We lost a restaurateur, an accountant, a senior care aide, a Gucci store manager, a makeup and hairstylist. We lost a place called Pulse. And what did we find? We found Snapchat videos, a nightclub drowned by an AR-15, a floor covered in cell phones, ringing but no one answering. We found Rihanna still singing, "When You Hold Me, I'm Alive," were like diamonds in the sky. We found heroes, like the mother of 11 and survivor of cancer who saved her son and lost her life. Like the lover who took 4 shots in his back to shove his lover to safety. Like the Muslims who got no media coverage. The security guard who saved 70. The trauma center doctor yelling, "We have found a pulse."
Wow. What inspires your writing, Blaine?
It has to be a very strong event like the ones I've just mentioned. The other thing for me is I'm a very visual person. So photographs from the past, images in a newspaper, etc. If it's powerful enough, a poem will come out of it. And sometimes it's a memory that's so vivid that it calls on me just simply to write it. An example of that is the one I've got here called Picking Peas. Taste of freshness in the mouth, saliva rises to the occasion. A time to prepare the garden sacrifice, with the elder giving quiet direction. A taste of real earth in the mouth.
I can taste those peas. I hope you audience can taste it as well. Do you have anything else you'd like to share with us?
This is one that maybe an older part of the audience at least will relate to. I was flipping through a book of iconic images from the last probably 50 years or so. And there's a particular image of Marilyn Monroe that everyone, I think, that is of a particular age recognizes, and that is her standing over top of a vent with the dress
With the white dress.
Updraft. Calculated move, Norma Jean, and you knew it. Heat from 100 onlookers below added 1,000 more curves to the already beautiful body of yours. After that, everyone had the 7-year itch for you. That itch led to scratching. They say somebody awfully big scratched you. A definite reference to one of the political people that Marilyn Monroe was acquainted with, and that may have wanted her mouth to be silenced. That's where when I talk about the connection to the psychology and the history, I always try to put a little bit of the what if in the mind of the person who I'm talking about would have been there.
Are you friends with other poets?
Definitely with most local poets society. In particular, we had about 12 years of inviting poets from all over Canada into Lethbridge, and so it's not just the local poets that I've connected with. There have been people as distant as Montreal all the way through to Vancouver Island that are poets that, as I said, I've had a chance to connect with. And in fact, when one of them passes, it's like losing a friend, and I may have only met them for one evening during a reading series that most local put on. But as I said, the emails, the Facebook connections, etc., have kept what otherwise would have been a fleeting memory, a strong friendship.
Well, I think you can connect through poetry with people even without meeting them personally. And poetry might have a big influence on our lives.
Yeah, I would say one thing concerning poetry that I think it does better than any other literary genre, and that is it captures the emotion of a particular time period, a particular moment. And because poetry is usually a short form, it's a case of crystallizing it down to something that is going to hit you and intensely hit you. And in the case of the Ritalin poem, that was emailed to me, but as I said, it hit me so hard just reading it that, as I said, it was a case of I have to keep this one around, and I'm going to use it where it's appropriate in an interview or a presentation off the stage. And as I said, it's one of the few poems that I did not write, but as I said, had such a powerful effect on me, I have to share it as well. So Ritalin's getting extra marketing, if you will.
Good. How does meeting other poets influence your life?
I think it's a case of, as I said, opening my eyes to other possibilities, and one of the people who's really helped me in my literary career, getting published in particular, is a man by the name of Richard Stevenson, who lives in the city of Lethbridge. Richard has put 31 books out, and I feel very grateful to have him, to count him as a friend, because I've been able to put a manuscript in front of him, and he will very quietly go through it and then go, okay, this reads really well. Even as a friend, he's one who's quite prepared to say to me, Blaine, this is a piece of junk. If you're going to get this published, be quite prepared to pick and choose. And the other thing he suggested to me is always have a second set of eyes look at your poetry, and on occasion read it to you. Read your own work back to you.
Oh.
Because what he says you'll begin to discover is what you might have intended to put across, or the particular way the words you were fitting them together isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a case of, as I said, that second set of eyes, that second voice, causes you to go, okay, I really didn't intend that particular emotion to come across, or that particular image to come across. Oops, it has. Okay, I need to go back and rework what's going on. And as I think every writer has said, the job of writing poetry, novel, whatever, never ends. The publisher usually has to grab it from your hands and go, enough.
Yes, there's that 5th and the 10th and the 15th tweak to it, and it just never ends unless you say, that was it.
Mm-hmm.
If you could tell your younger self anything, what would you say?
I think the strongest bit of advice I would put across is be prepared to do your own thing, and if things aren't working out in a particular area, be prepared to pick up and move. I find that even with the poetry that I'm very ready to experiment with all forms of poetry, to go, okay, I've tried this out, it either worked or it didn't work, okay, let's try something else. A manuscript I'm currently working on is what I call response poems. I've taken the words of a 12th century Muslim poet by the name of Rumi, who might be known to some people, put his poems against my own poems, and this is concerning the event of 9/11. And I thought in particular, picking a Muslim poet, when in fact the whole Muslim world was basically painted with a grand brush as you're to blame.
Mm-hmm.
Some of Rumi's words basically pointed out to me, because I was reading Rumi right around that time, is some of the emotions, the pain, the hatred, the life experience that a 12th century Muslim wrote about is a part of my life as well. We may be 8 centuries apart. We may be of different particular religious creeds, But as I said, there are some things that are so common to human life that you make that connection. As you said earlier, it's about mixing with poets, some of which you only get to read the words. They're long gone.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, they're of some other culture and religious creed, etc. But it's a case of you begin to read it and go, this connects with me.
Well, and Rumi's work is evergreen. It's still relevant, a lot of it.
Yeah, as I said, it just was amazing to me as I'm living through the 9/11 events, which included my marriage to an American woman.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said, all of that human emotion that Rumi was bringing up was basically being transferred, as I said, from Rumi to my own life, back to Rumi. And the particular book I was reading, it was a translation by Coleman Barks called Birdsong. It's not a very big collection of Rumi poems, but as I'm looking at it, I'm literally going, this one fits, and this one fits,
Mm-hmm.
and this one fits. And as a result, as I said, I put what I called response poems together. Another book that I have had published is called The False Mirror, and it's looking at the work of Matisse, Magritte, and Picasso, and how or actually not Picasso, Salvador Dali, looking at the way each of them looked at war, the human eye, the human body, and in looking at the fact that they were looking at things in a very different way, also going, okay, for this particular artist, I will write poetry in this particular style, with this poet in a different style. So the book has basically 3 different ways of putting poetry to the page in this book, written by me, but as I said, trying to reflect the very different viewpoints each of those artists had.
Interesting. Do you have an example of your Rumi connection, or any of the books you were talking about?
Actually, give me a moment and I will come to Rumi poems. The manuscript, as it's titled right now, is called Crossing the Border, because I married an American woman. She moved from Libby, Montana to Lethbridge, Alberta, so there literally was a crossing of the border. But I also see it as a crossing of the border between a Muslim of 800 years ago to me in present day. The first verse you're going to hear is a translation of Rumi's work, and then I'll follow it up with my response to his work.
Wonderful.
September 7th, 2001. In your light I learned to love, in your beauty how to make poems. You dance inside my chest, where no one sees you, but sometimes I do. And that sight becomes this art. The day before the ceremony, you danced inside my chest. You talked, we walked. You helped make my poetry You helped me make my poetry again. We are crossing the border into man and life. This particular manuscript went from about December of 2000 through to October of 2002, where we engaged in a peace march because the Iraqi war had just begun. And my wife and I were at the front end of the march, and the Lethbridge newspaper, the Lethbridge Herald photographer, took a picture of the 2 of us at the very front of this peace march, And my wife said, the country I came from, I would immediately be on the rolls of the FBI or the CIA
Oh, wow.
for doing something like this. And I went, thank God for Canada.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, I could read the rest of it. It's a very long narrative poem, so maybe we get on to other questions.
I would love to hear the rest of it, but I do need to make an announcement for viewers who are just tuning in, or listeners. You are listening to Jess FM radio and watching Jess TV with producer-host Teri Petz. You can watch us live on Facebook and on jessfm.ca, or download our free apps on iPhone and Android. And now back to our guest, Blaine Greenwood. Blaine has worn many, many hats in his life, but today we are focusing on his poetry. Yes, so you wanted to move on to another question. What does literary success look like to you?
I think at the age that I'm at, the fact that 2 books are already published is what I consider a success. If I were a younger man, my 30s or 40s, I might be looking, as Richard Stevenson has done, at the fact that there's a long literary career in front of me, 31 books, and as I said in his case, I'm going, I'll just bask in the limelight of Richard. I've got probably 12 manuscripts on the go, and I'm hoping to get a good number of them published over the next probably 5 to 10 years. So I will be busy for the rest of my life, basically.
I was just going to say something like that. That should keep you busy for a few days.
Oh, yes.
Well, let's hear some more poems.
I don't know whether very many people still can fruit, but this particular poem came out of the canning of peaches, and has a bit of a sensuous edge to it, to be blunt. Peeling peaches. Scent of ripe bodies beckons us to begin. Gem jars gathered, waiting, with mouths open, just like us. Blanched fruit dives into ice water. Slimy fuzz slippery in hand. Difficult disrobing still takes place. I put together Called Rags. I believe it had a run of about 15 years. And this is a poem concerning Henri Matisse. And I'll get into a few more of his poems in a bit. It's called The Art of Balance. We enter his paintings, enter his mind, enter his life. Here is the luxury of line, shape, color in a picnic at Saint-Tropez. Here is the calm of lagoon and coral in Oceania and the Caribbean. Here is the pleasure of a full-breasted female nude, her face filled with evocative mythology. Here find those rooms of Baudelaire filled with furniture of ancient sheen, the rarest flowers, whiffs of amber, painted ceilings, fathomless mirrors filled with the splendor of the East. Here everything is order and beauty. Here everything has become luxury, calm, and pleasure. Here poetry becomes oxygen. You breathe it deeply with every rising sun, every morning making love to it with long, firm strokes upon the canvas, here beneath your brush.
Wonderful. Thank you. I guess reading your bio, I don't have to ask you if you consider writing to be a spiritual practice, because I know it is, but I wondered if you could elaborate on it a little bit.
I think with the initial poems, and I would say this to anybody who's reading those first few poems, it's a sort of clearinghouse for some of the demons that it may have troubled you. As I said, some of those poems of mine basically cleared a lot of emotional crap, to be blunt, out of my life. They're ones I don't necessarily read on the stage, but as I said, just a case of going, okay, let's dive into what my life has been to this point, and where can I take it from here, and making it a sort of growth pattern. What I find by doing that initially, the moment you put a particular issue to the page, you can go, okay, it's out of the head and it's on the paper. I can begin to analyze it there. It doesn't need to run around in my head forever after. And as I said, that's why, as I said, I highly recommend to people, if you've got those issues, get them down on paper. Poetry, because as I said, I think it is laden with emotion. It's probably one of the best genres to actually, as I said, get those issues out. And to not be concerned at all about, is there a rhyme scheme, or anything else. Just drop it to the page. What I found in my later writings, the two books that got published, Black Cat in the Shadows and The False Mirror, is looking at other artists' lives and going, is there some kind of general message that I can put across to others that in fact I've had as part of my own life? Black Cat in the Shadows includes Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, Aubrey Beardsley, Eric Satie, and Vincent van Gogh. There were lots of other people who came to Le Chat Noir who were a lot more famous than those particular people. Claude Debussy being an example of a piano player that Eric Satie, as I said, just constantly was comparing himself to and always falling short. What I did in choosing those particular individuals is to say to my fellow artists, poets, writers, etc., whatever you have to say, get it out. What in fact happened at Le Chat Noir that I find really interesting, and there's in fact some artist friends of mine that are doing this, is Le Chat Noir, they created what they called La Galerie de Refusés, the gallery of junk. Some of the early paintings by Vincent van Gogh, the posters by Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, Beardsley's early drawings. Despite the fact he was English, he visited Paris on regular occasion as a young man. But this gallery was full of, as I said, works that the major galleries refused to put up. So they put their own gallery together and basically said to the public, do you want to see what I'm producing rather than Debussy in the case of Eric Satie? Come and enjoy a concert with Eric Satie playing the piano instead of Debussy, who's got a concert hall full of people. So as I said, the later manuscripts for me have been a case of, is there some kind of general message for me and for the reading public or the audience that I'm connecting with that I can put across? And as I said, with Black Cat in the Shadows, it's a case of don't let anybody put a border around your work or go, your work isn't good enough or whatever. If you have to, gather with other artists of like mind and go, I'm going to find a place where I present my work and find the particular niche market or audience that happens to love my work. what I've discovered with going to Owl Poetry and to other open mics is there are young poets who are writing constantly about the breakup of a love relationship, etc. And I'm long past that. But it's a case of looking out at the audience and going, that particular poet on stage is actually connecting with the 20 people who are sitting over there who are the same age. It doesn't do much for me, but I'm not the arbiter of what a particular audience should be looking at. I'm my own particular audience. There are particular things I like. There are particular things I don't like. But that doesn't mean I have every right to say off the stage, because there are 20 people over here who are going, I absolutely connect with where this young woman or young man is coming from, because they're possibly going through the same experience as well. So I would say, again, from a spiritual connection, to be a little less judgmental as to who I put under the microscope. And on occasion, I'm finding it's me I'm putting under the microscope and going, I may write well, but it's a case of I'm still working at presenting my work well, and realizing, because of having surrounded myself with lots of spoken word artists, that world of spoken word artistry is now pulling me to become much better at presenting my work, and realizing there's a long ways to go. We've had the poet who presented at the Olympics in Vancouver, actually in our home, Shane Koizen. And as I said, it just, when you hear him even speak in an interview, it's a case of, I'm miles from where Shane is, so it's a case of saying to me, stretch yourself. Rather than comparing yourself to Shane, a case of can I be doing something that I'm doing poetry-wise a little better?
Well, and that's just life. Shane is miles away from where you are.
Oh, yes.
You have your own contribution, and he might learn something from you.
Yeah.
We all have something to contribute.
Oh, yes.
Is there another poem you'd like to share with us?
This particular poem that I'm about to read, Black Cat in the Shadows, came about as a result of me going to an art show in 2000 at the Glenwood, or the Glenbow Museum. I looked at a piece of artwork that Henri Toulouse-Lautrec had done over 113 years before. It was done on rag paper. It should have fallen apart within 10 years. Somebody managed to protect it. And I had a chance to literally have my fingers half an inch away from a piece of artwork that Henri Toulouse-Lautrec did. There was a very famous dancer by the name of Jeanne Aville, who he drew with a snake dress, the snake basically out of fabric wrapped around her dress. And as I said, this one tiny little illustration hit me so powerfully that, as I said, this poem came out of it. And gradually, an entire book.
Wow.
So I'm going to say to people, start with that small inspiration. You have no idea where it could take you. Pale and delicate flower. I stood before you, pale and delicate flower, you in your little wooden frame, you dancing there on that world of rag paper, more than 100 years old. You, the daughter of Belle-Elise, and member of the Holy Sisterhood. You knew Milan and Verlaine. You were a rider at the Hippodrome. You lift his cane and touch his chin. Then his eyes, his fingers touched you. Drew the snake coiled around you, like an absinthe muse, like a serpent under glass, all of us captured in the quivering frenzy of your dance.
I had to look away because I could visualize her as you were reading it.
Yeah, and this is one thing that I would like to touch on. I have what I call sort of the 3 points concerning the writing of poetry and the reader as well. Number one, look at it as an experiment. Some experiments work out really well, other ones fall flat.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is what I would call, or what has been called, ekphrasis, and that is the details you put in the poem. Particular details you put in the poem are going to aim an audience or grab a particular audience in a particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And the third E that I include is experience. Some of the poetry that I have written about Are We to Lose the Trek and Vincent van Gogh has meant very little to a person until they're standing in front of that painting or that illustration.
Mm-hmm.
Because of my sister receiving one of my books and being in New York City where there was a Van Gogh display, she chose to go and see the Van Gogh display due to the fact I had teased her with some poems about Vincent van Gogh.
Wow.
So as I said, that case of looking at the experience of your reader and going, maybe they're not ready at this point to fully understand all that you want to get across, but put it out there, plant a seed,
Mm-hmm.
and let it, go wherever it's going to go. But as I said, it was interesting to me that out of the 3 days she had in New York City, she actually took an entire afternoon to go and see a Van Gogh display, and then going, I know who put the seed in your head for that one.
Good. The power of poetry.
Mm-hmm.
I always knew poetry was powerful. How often do you write, Blaine?
I actually do a bit of writing every day, and the thing that I've come to understand is even putting an entry in my blog or a comment on Facebook, etc., is something that I consider writing. All of this, to me, feeds into the whole writing process.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, the Pulse nightclub came across as a news banner and filled for weeks my Facebook page. And it was a case of finally going, this is such a powerful event that it's even affecting me. I've got to put what I feel to paper.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said, I don't look at this and go, okay, I'm putting something on Facebook, that's not writing. I'm going, the moment I'm using words and they're being put to electronic paper or real paper. As I said, I've quit looking at the fact that I have to return to a manuscript day after day after day. There are some days that, as I said, working on a manuscript, things will flow, and other days it's a case of I simply hit a brick wall, and it's a case of step out of that, go and do something else,
Mm-hmm.
come back to it. And what I found amazing with the current manuscript that I'm working on, I added an entire new section to the manuscript and found out after several weeks of trying to make this new section work that it needed to be removed. That there was a cohesive unit already there. There was what would work as a manuscript to go to the publishers already intact. And I kept trying to mold it into something else. But as I said, it was a case of coming back with fresh eyes and looking at it and going, there's a reason this isn't working.
Mm-hmm.
This is the cohesive unit, and this is something you're trying to super glue onto it, and it isn't working. So remove it as carefully as you can and work at possibly a new form of the way you're writing it. And this is the one concerning crossing the border. What I decided with that was roomy poem, part of the response poem on the opposite page, turn the page, more of the response poem, and then the phrase concerning crossing the border into matrimony or into peace or into whatever would literally be one line on a single page.
Mm-hmm.
As I'm looking at it, I'm going, it works. And I'm not excusing myself or saying, you can't have one line on a page, because I go over to my bookshelf full of poets and go, here's an example of one line on a page. Here's an example of 4 voices in a poem. I was told by someone, Blaine, you can't have 4 different characters or voices in a poem. I'm sure this person was well-meaning, but it was a case of, thank God for Richard Stevenson after that writing session, saying, "Come on with for me with coffee," and he said, "Your poem actually worked." The poem Updraft was followed by another one concerning another visual image from the time of the Vietnam War, where there's a Viet Cong being shot by a soldier, and this happened to hit the television screen bang on as the execution was taking place. What I did in that poem, which is literally 8 lines long, first 2 lines are the cameraman, next 2 lines are the director, next 2 lines are the soldier, next 2 lines are an audience sort of in gasping motion.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, 4 different voices in 8 lines.
Wow.
So again, a case of saying to myself, because of advice from others, don't worry about somebody else's definition of what your work should be. Put it together, present it, and see if it works.
Mm-hmm.
It may not work. Again, we've talked about audience. It may not work for one particular audience, but another one will absolutely, thoroughly enjoy it. So it's a case of, don't be trying to please absolutely everybody.
You can't.
You can't do it.
No, that's impossible, no matter how good you are. Are there any habits you would give up to become a better writer or poet?
I think a little less television watching.
Mm.
There's a certain amount of enjoyment or information, etc., you can get from television, and a case of, I think, being selective and going, okay, I'm into poetry, this particular show is a really good one to connect with, but to, in a sense, leave the TV on afterwards and start flipping channels. As I said, I've learned that time that could be spent writing in any form, I'm spending just being a passive audience, and I'm going, that's not what I'm about.
Mm-hmm.
That's not who I am. If I want to call myself a writer, there'd better be some writing going on. And it's almost a case of going, do you want to anesthetize yourself by everything that's flowing off the blue screen and that going? An example yesterday, the television was on for literally half an hour, and I'm going, I thoroughly enjoyed the day. But it's a case of going, okay, what do I need to be about? I've got an interview I need to be prepared for, poems I need to pick to present. And as I said, that would be one thing, to be really careful as to what you're watching. And I would say on occasion, to not be procrastinating about getting yourself in front of an audience. What I'm finding with a lot of publishers now is they don't want to do the marketing. They want to do the publishing. They do not want to do the marketing. And it's a case that if you're going to have your work out there where people can connect with it, you have to get out to readings, out to open mics, etc., and make sure that people hear your work and can go, yeah, I can relate to that. But as I said, there are publishers now who want nothing to do with the marketing. In the, in quotes, old days of 10 years ago, they would have been more than happy to make sure not only did your book get in front of an audience at a conference or whatever, they might have even paid your way to be there to sign books. As I said, those days are gone.
It's over, yes. But I think there isn't any better marketing than being out there and making that personal connection with people, because there's nothing better.
Well, in fact, one of the reasons for picking up on this opportunity to have an interview, as I said, I'm looking at this going, this is one more way, one more potential audience that, as I said, I can read my poetry to and have them go, I really like what he said concerning the police officer, or that's caused me to think the whole issue over again. And as I said, the fact that I, as a senior citizen, experienced vicariously the fact that a week after this happened at the Pulse nightclub, a senior citizen was shot. And I went, that connection that I thought was 3 or 4 steps away isn't anymore. It's a lot closer.
Is there another poem you'd like to share with us?
I don't know how many of you have had a chance to see the DVD called Loving Vincent. 16,000 still paintings or photographs were put together to make a movie of Vincent van Gogh's life. And the one thing concerning Vincent van Gogh that almost everyone knows is he cut off his left ear. Part of what I wanted to do in this poem was indicate to people concerning Vincent van Gogh, don't necessarily believe everything that the mass media has put out there concerning Vincent van Gogh. I give you a few hints in this poem that may tell you need to be looking at even the cutting of the ear off, possibly with a bit of a skeptical eye. My left ear. There are things sinister in my mind. They crept in there through my left ear. This ear that hears those other things, like eyes that see what is not there. My dear Paul, your left ear hears the ancient secrets of theosophistry, while mine hears nothing but the stiff winds of God's North Sea. I would seek the zephyrs of the south, paint boats on an almost foreign beach, but damn you, Paul, You would find your South in her, your 13-year-old tanned Tahitian pride. There are things sinister in my mind. They crept in there through my left ear. This ear that hears those other things, like eyes that see what is not there. To me, Paul, you came like arrogant but cornered mouse, almost God to me, but you angered me on December 23. When you stole my sunflowers, you stole me. You drove me mad, nay, murdered me. I wished to slit your throat, holding razor in my hand, but your eyes did break my mind, and I went home to the yellow house and took my left ear instead. There are things sinister in my mind. They crept in there through my left ear, this ear that hears those other things, like eyes that see what is not there. My left ear, it did offend me much, with talk that was not there. They will poison you, Vincent van Gogh, they will. Gauguin, yes, he will, when the weather traps me in the yellow house. I lopped off the demented ear, sliced it from my life, wrapped it in a handkerchief, and gave it to a pretty lady of my choice. They all came to see the bloody mess when Gauguin ran away. Then blessed St. Paul would hold me tight within his arms. There are things sinister in my mind. They crept in there through my left ear, this ear that hears those other things, like eyes that see what is not there. The one detail I put in there is about the fact that Vincent van Gogh saw Paul Gauguin as an almost god, that he could do nothing wrong. Vincent van Gogh comes home after being out in the town and discovers that Gauguin is copying the very famous Van Gogh painting, Sunflowers, and is going to take it back to Paris and sell the Gauguin version.
Oh.
My suspicions, and these are suspicions of a few other people who studied the life of Vincent van Gogh, is that Paul Gauguin and Vincent actually were in a fight, and that the ear may have been lopped off not by Vincent van Gogh, but by Paul Gauguin.
Oh.
Because there was a bit of knife and sword play happening during this argument.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said, I drop a little detail in there that causes you possibly to go, he saw him as a god. Is there a chance that maybe Vincent van Gogh was covering Paul Gauguin's tracks by saying, I actually did this. I can't blame God. I have to blame me.
Interesting. Did you ever consider being a crime scene investigator?
That probably is something that, as I said, from the psychology point of things, would, and maybe even the visual aspect might have been a career to have taken at one point.
And do you find any difficult parts in your artistic process?
I think I've already alluded to that a little bit by saying that sometimes the manuscript gets to a point that you go, I just need to add something extra here to make it work just a little bit better. And it's a case, as I said, in the one manuscript, that an entire section of the book manuscript had to be removed, and all of a sudden it worked again. It flowed. It didn't sort of run into a brick wall. It worked right up until the end of the series of poems. And one thing Richard Stevenson said to me concerning one of his poems, he spent 15 years working on a single poem.
Oh, wow.
And wondered why it didn't work. One day he looks at the poem and goes, it's actually 3 different poems. It's the beginning of three poems. This verse forms a poem that I have to deal with.
Continue with.
This verse, another poem. this verse, yet another poem. But as I said, sometimes the difficulty is in being able to step back. And as I said earlier, sometimes a fresh set of eyes or somebody reading your own work to you, you look at it and go, it was difficult for them to get through all 3 verses. Let's have them read just the one verse.
Mm-hmm.
Where could I take that other than where I did originally? And as I said, I would suggest to every writer a second set of eyes, a second voice actually reading your work out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a good idea.
It reminds me of my former career, which was gardening and landscaping. And sometimes I had to not only look at the plants, but make space for them, prune them back. Also, I had to do a lot of weeding.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like writing poetry is a little bit like weeding.
Almost.
Leave in what should be there and pull the weeds out and get rid of what shouldn't be there.
Yeah. Most definitely.
I'd like to make other announcement for people who are just tuning in. You are listening to Jess FM Radio and watching Jess TV with producer-host Teri Petz. You can watch us live on Facebook and on jessfm.ca or download our free apps on iPhone and Android. And Jesse, how is our time going? Okay. Well, do you have another poem you'd like to share with us?
One of the experiments that I did concerning the René Magritte poems, he's called a surrealistic painter, but what he tends to do is use what might be considered real images, but they're put in such a way that you go, there's something hidden underneath here. It isn't just what's on the face of the painting.
Mm-hmm.
And one that he painted in 1967 is called The Great War. I'm going to read you one verse that basically describes what's on the surface of the painting, and the second verse which describes what I think is the underlying message.
Mm-hmm.
But what I did with these 2 verses is actually at one point melded them together.
Oh.
So we'll read one verse, second verse, and then I will meld both verses, actually working them together.
Oh, sounds good.
The Great War, 1967. Proper lady, all dressed up in purest white, parasol in hand, picture hat with plumes, her pendant purse, corseted waist. She wears a mask of pretty posies for this great war, for that great war, for the next great war. And here's the underlying message for me. The actual news becomes the decorated news. The deception on the blue box becomes the real within our minds. The irrational becomes the rational thing to do. Let us pick our pretty posies for her face. And now, pushing both verses together. Proper lady, the actual news, all dressed up in purest white, becomes parasol in hand, the decorated views. Picture hat with plumes, the deception on the blue box. Her pendant purse becomes the real corseted waist within our minds. She wears a mask of pretty posies, the irrational, for this great war becomes the irrational thing to do for that great war. Let us pick pretty posies for the next great war, her face. I would say one thing concerning my poetry, as I said, every time I put out another manuscript in front of myself to work on, I'm constantly going, okay, is there a new form I can try? Is there some, as I said, response poem, or what this type of poem is called is an acrostic, where you can read across the page as well as down one side, down the other. What is it? Just, I guess what I would say is playing with the form, having fun with it. And I think that's one thing that, even with some serious topics, that at some point you need to maybe step back and go, is there a way of putting this together, manipulating it, etc., so that there's a bit of a fun aspect in there. The topic or the issue may not be something that's going to be funny, but as I said, is there a way to put it across in such a way that it hasn't been done before, at least by you? And this was the other thing with the acrostic poetry. I thought I came up with a new form. Took it over to my friend Richard, handed it to him. He goes, the entire manuscript is acrostic poetry. I'm going, so I didn't come up with something new?
I thought you invented the wheel.
And that's why I come back to the whole idea of this was new for me. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that, yes, somebody may have accomplished this particular way of doing things before. It was fresh for me. It worked for me. And again, this whole idea of being careful not to even edit your own work the moment somebody says, oh, that's already been done. So what?
Everything has been done before.
Yeah.
And the telephone wasn't invented by just one person.
Yeah.
And does your family support your career as a poet, writer, and artist?
I would say my wife in particular definitely supports me. In fact, she's got 2 manuscripts that she constantly wants to keep from the publishers, and my attitude is in the next few weeks I'm taking her work over to Richard Stevenson to be edited. I think it needs to get into print. So we have 2 poets, 2 writers in the house.
Oh boy.
And definitely supporting each other, and definitely 2 very different styles of writing. My extended family, every time I've done a reading in Red Deer, Edmonton, or elsewhere where there's family in place, they've come out to support me. And as I said, what's amazing is in the case of my sister, who did the visit to the Vincent van Gogh exhibit in New York. She was an accountant for Revenue Canada. And I'm going, the last person, because of the very mathematical mind that I would have thought would connect with poetry. And so as I said, again, a case of not even judging your audience and going, well, I won't invite her because, no.
You can't.
I've learned to use much more the shotgun approach. Who do I know at Edmonton? Invite them all. And those who come may enjoy it, may not enjoy it, may walk out of there with a copy of the book. And again, as I said, it's a case of planting seeds in my estimation.
How can we buy your books?
I'll give you my email address. That's one way we can do it. Blaine.greenwood@gmail.com. Also, if you get on any search engine and put Blaine Greenwood poet, my blog will show up. Several other connections through Facebook, etc., will show up. So,
Good.
Send me an email, send me a message. More than happy to sign a book and get it off to you.
Great. and you come to the Owl every once in a while, where I host a monthly poetry night. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us?
I find it absolutely amazing that for the small city that Lethbridge is, that this city has had since the early 90s a section of people, both as the writers and as audience, that are supporting poetry. One group, Teri, that you definitely need to get in here, and they're going to have to make the studio a little larger, are the high school kids out of Nobleford.
Yes, I heard of them.
Yeah.
The slam poetry?
Yeah.
Yes.
What I find absolutely amazing for kids that are in grade 10 is the quality of the work that's coming out of the 16-year-olds that are there in grade 10. And as I said, in a community of Nobleford, they're taking a regular trip up to Calgary and Edmonton and taking on slam poets in Calgary and Edmonton and walking away with some of the prize money. And I'm
Wow.
going, if Nobleford can do this, any community, I don't care what size you are, you know, if you've got even a single poet, encourage the living daylights out of them to get out there and present their stuff. As I said, definitely chase down the Nobleford kids. I've also mentioned Richard Stevenson several times. Lethbridge is going to soon miss that individual because he's moving to Nanaimo. So I would suggest at some point before Richard leaves town, Teri, it might be a good idea to get Richard on the show.
Okay. I am making notes of that. Jesse, how is our time? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the end of our show. You were listening to Jess FM Radio and watched Jess TV with host producer Teri Petz. You can watch us live on Facebook and on jessfm.ca, and you can download our free apps on iPhone and Android. Have a wonderful day, everybody.